Hello everyone. Today I'm excited to welcome back Ksenia Kondratieva, independent journalist based in Moscow. So Ksenia, once again welcome back and thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for having me again.
So I want to start by asking you about the latest update about the Russia-Ukraine war. We know that in the last 1 month Russia made incremental gains around the Kharkiv region. So what is the latest update about the war?
See, I believe we should not talk about the latest updates on the front line without the maps, because all these names that I would otherwise use, they don't make much sense to a lot of English-speaking audience, right? So you can follow the movements. That are Western sources, that are a lot of Russian Telegram channels that report in English, and that have all the maps on a daily basis and that have smallest updates on a daily basis. What is important here is that we are 2.5 years into the conflict, and Russia has been making gains since considerable gains since spring of 2024. Um, the most fierce fighting is happening, in, as you said, in Kharkiv region. Let's not forget that. That also means that Russian regions bordering Ukraine in that area, because we have borders elsewhere, are also bearing the brunt, and there are lots of casualties on the Russian side because of Ukrainian strikes. So the I happen to meet a lot of people from outside Russia. Many of them are from India or other South Asian countries, and they all ask me like, well, the hostilities have nearly stopped. No, they're not. There are casualties, multiple casualties on a daily basis on both sides. Unfortunately, so the conflict is going on. Now, Russia has been making advances for various reasons. Russia is performing in this conflict from a military perspective very differently than it used to in the initial stages of the war. I mean, the kind of army, the kind of coordination we see now is it's a very different army, I would say. Also, as you well remember, we would assume that Ukraine experiencing two major difficulties. One is resources, as in men. They need people to fight. I wouldn't go into the data, into the exact figures, because first of all, that's against the Russian law. Secondly, I think whatever figures on casualties that we see in the press, no matter which press, this is nothing much to do with the reality. So I wouldn't go into exact figures, but what I'm hearing from various sources, and not just in Russia, that Ukraine's casualties are much higher than Russian casualties. Now, you can so just as non-expert, you can also see the pictures of Ukrainian cemeteries, and it's horrifying. Um, I don't think there are such casualties in Russia. At least, again, we don't see the evidence of that. Of course, people are dying as well, but it's a different ratio. Now, another thing. So why there are heavy casualties? Because of the kind of equipment being used. Ukrainian army is also a very professional army, and that's what Russian commanders are saying. It's a very professional war, right? Both armies are, strong. They know what they're doing, but then how much munitions you have to fire every day, that's what matters. Till the new aid package, almost 60 billion package was approved by the US to Ukraine. It took several months to get it approved, right? There were huge debates in US. There were huge debates in the entire West. To get this approved, and so there was a crunch of crunch of weapons with Ukraine. So that's why Russia, I guess, was able to. advance as much as it could. Now, if you read the reports produced, let's say, by Washington-based Institute, ISW, Institute of Study of War. Now, again, it's an American think tank, right? So they have their own narrative, but they would say that Russia has advanced just some dozen of kilometers in the past few months. You know, on the front line, this dozen kilometers. It means a bit different. It's a terrain, and there are people living there, right? So if Russia would advance uh, many kilometers per day, we would see casualties like in Gaza, but it's a very different conflict. It's a very different approach of how to conduct the war that Russia is using for the past 2.5 years, right? And I would like to believe that civilian casualty or human lives would still be a priority for both countries, you know, when they're conducting the war. Um, so that's, I guess, the status, but it can change anytime. It can change anytime, and the kind of weapons Ukraine has been getting now, the long-range weapons, and especially with the U.S. And some of the other countries approving, UK, Germany approving the strikes inside Russia. um, I think the conflict is becoming much more escalated, much more dangerous for people, for civilians, because most of the strikes that we see, at least inside Russia, they are on civilians. They're just in the middle of the city, or the entire part of the building collapses, and there are dozens of victims.
So, how has Russia decided to respond to the decision of the West to allow strikes inside Russia?
I think Russia condemned this, and Russia's response is always quite, similar in these kind of cases, that it will attack um, whatever it considers, a threat to its security, and that we believe is what it is doing. Again, it has been uh, 2.5 years into the war, and the ability of, let's say, media people and analysts who analyze the military aspect of the war to analyze what are the targets, both for Ukraine and for Russia, has increased. Still, the fog of war is something that you should not dismiss. And Russia would, both parties of the conflict would claim that they target munition or bases or some um, munition storage places, right? When they strike, but then uh, it's very difficult to check without being on the ground. So sitting and reporting from the main city, I'm based in St. Petersburg. It's very different. You cannot go and check.
So, coming to the peace summit, it contained many proposals regarding the use of nuclear weapons, food security, and the swapping of prisoners on the Russian and Ukrainian side. So, what is your opinion as a Russian journalist since Russia was not invited to the summit?
Well, I don't think the communique that we see has any proposals as such. It just highlights that nuclear sites should not be targeted, because we know the situation at Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, ZNPP. There is under heavy shelling. It has not been. It has been off. It's operational, but it's a different operational mode. It doesn't produce electricity. um, and there have been multiple visits of International Atomic Agency and its head Grossi to the site, and they were quite diplomatic, of course, in their reviews and responses of what's happening there, but they didn't condemn Russia for, hitting. It's under Russia control. They didn't condemn Russia, unlike Ukraine and the West does, that Russia is hitting a power plant under its own control, right? So they realize what's happening there. And that's why it was an important statement. See, the peace summit, if you read Communiqué, it's not even clear what is it is dealing with. It's not dealing with anything. It's not dealing with the resolution of the conflict. It just mentions some aspects of the important aspects, but it doesn't have any proposals. It in fact knows that it will be a prerequisite for future talks. Well, it notes that future talks or talks on peace have to have two sides, and that's what the countries, significant global powers, who didn't sign this communique and who disassociated from this document. They said peace talks should be carried by two sides. It cannot involve one side. It's completely useless, and that's what Russia's position on this has been, that there can't be peace talks without a party to the conflict, with only one party. So I think this was, well, the Kremlin have called it a PR effort and many other things. But I mean, as a journalist, I know how these kind of summits, global summits, are organized. It's just, let me put it that way, it's a waste of money that could be used in a much better way for humanitarian purpose, because the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine and elsewhere in the world is just, rising. Um, and I believe it was a PR effort because we have U.S. election coming. We have U.S. election coming. Another thing is that it's very important. The Ukrainian president, if we can call him so, because his mandate has expired, Ukrainian leader, Mr. Zelensky, um, he's legally, I mean, it's not even clear whether he's legally a president. There are no elections, even though Ukrainian constitution does not prevent the presidential election from happening in the wartime. So yeah, um, that's all. That peace summit in Switzerland probably was a morale attempt for morale booster, and also instate some legitimacy into Zelensky's role, because no elections. I'm sure people, we don't get much information from Ukraine. If you read Ukrainian media, it's again it's a conflict going on, but it has been heavily monitored, right? So it's very much like in Russia, but that's understandable because the two countries fighting would have their limitations on the way media works. We have seen this throughout all the conflicts. But there is quite less of really independent and agenda-free reporting from Ukraine that would show what actually Ukrainians think now, 2 years, 2.5 years into the war.
So I want to talk about Mr. Putin's proposals. He proposed that Ukraine should accept all the territory that Russia has occupied and should not join NATO for a peace proposal to be discussed. So, do you think these proposals could act as non-starters for the Western countries trying to negotiate this conflict?
Uh, the Western countries have already said that these are non-starters, and it was clear from the beginning. Um, Now, on the day peace conference started in Switzerland, New York Times have published a list of documents, the drafts of agreements that Moscow and Kiev would have signed or discussed to probably possibly sign in March and April 2022, so 2 months
In
into one or two
Istanbul.
months into the conflict. Yeah, including Istanbul. There were 3 rounds of talks that time. Somehow this entire episode is never noticed, is never amplified in the reporting on the war, that countries could have reached peace just 1 month into the war, and we could have avoided so much casualties and destruction on both sides. Now, the peace talks were held after Istanbul round of talks, if you remember correctly. Uh, Russia, it called it a gesture of goodwill, have retracted from the Kiev region, which is now, if you read any Western media report, I just read one now, I think it was Guardian or something. It was called Ukraine's significant victory. Okay, victory negotiations, but not, the Ukrainian troops didn't throw Russian army out of the Kiev region. Russians just retreated, and then we had Bucha. We can debate. It's a different topic of debate whether it was, state who is responsible for all these atrocities committed there. I don't want to go into that right now. I believe someday investigation will show if it is conducted. I don't even understand whether it's conducted or not, it's being conducted or not, because what we saw after Bucha is that a lot of, media, there was a press tour organized by Ukrainian government to Bucha to show the atrocities, the bodies lying around. And what's after that? What is there an investigation going? There is no reporting about that. To remind, Russia's position is that these atrocities were committed by Ukrainians themselves and not by retreating Russians. So, I mean, we don't know who's right or wrong, but we don't also know whether there is any independent investigation going on, right? So, back to Vladimir Putin's proposals. What is important here is Ukraine's status, because as he himself reminded, and he keeps reminding it, but it seems that it falls on the deaf ears, that Ukraine's membership in NATO was never acceptable to Russia. And the entire move that he decided to do in February 2022 was about that, because West has not been has not been talking on that. There were rounds of negotiations. The diplomatic route was used up to, I guess, up to the limits if he decided to start what he. Now, what people have a counter argument to that is that Finland and Sweden joined, right, NATO, and they are also close to Russia's borders, right? So how does it make any difference if they've decided to join it? Well, probably from a military perspective, we would talk about the using these countries for placing U.S. weapons, long-range weapons, or even nuclear arms, which is a security threat for Russia. I think Ukraine, frankly speaking, I've not got perfect response from the Russian government. Neither Mr. Putin, or maybe I'm not aware, but there's not a determined response to that argument, to that question. Why is it so different? But I would say that Ukraine, which hosts such a huge number of Russian-speaking people, is a much more sensitive matter. So this was the main issue, and I think Putin just reiterated Russia's position that unless this is resolved, and by the way, what is important is that in the documents published by New York Times 2 days back, this, if you read carefully, Ukraine was ready to foresee its NATO membership. It wanted to be a member of EU, which is okay, which is fine and economically very understandable, because a lot of people from Ukraine already have been working in Poland and other EU countries, and they have been sending money back home. So economically, Ukraine is very much integrated into EU. So that was clear, but it was ready to forgo its ambitions to become a NATO member. There were other points that Ukraine was not agreeing for in those documents. I'm talking about the draft agreement back in 2022. Status of Crimea is something that they could not come up with. The one of the draft, the latest draft, mentions that status of Crimea should be negotiated, but not by military means, by diplomatic route in the next 1 decade. So this is one point. And then Ukraine was not agreeing to keep Russian language, which used to be an official language in Ukraine, apart from Ukrainian. It refused to keep Russian language as an official language, which you have to understand. One third of population probably speaks Russian in that country, right? So, like, this is something that Russia was insisting on. And what is important is that no country so far has come forward to say that we will carry this attempt to for peace talks ahead. That is very important, and that is worrying because there is no there are no peace talks at sight for any foreseeable future, and that is very worrying.
I want to talk about the freezing of the Russian assets in the EU. Mr. Putin called it a theft. So, what countermeasures is Russia taking? Because I read in the Russian press that Russia was preparing to seize US assets as well.
That's a good question. Of course, by international law and all kind of norms of the international law, seizing, freezing assets and then using it, to fund something else. Is not acceptable, and that's why it took years, I think 1.5 years, for negotiations over this, and finally they have decided that they will be able to do it. That was the G7 announcement. Now, this is a huge amount of 300 billion. It's a huge amount of assets. Now, Russia's response, I think, has been so far limited because probably Moscow is waiting for the right time. Um, what has been already happening is there are some assets of European companies that uh, have been sold to the Russian and some Chinese businesses. There are a couple of examples like this, beer breweries and car factories. So I think Russia will exercise its kind of right to retaliate economically. Of course, Russia is not as such a huge economic power as US or China for that matter, right? So it has to be careful to protect its own economy, its own market, and its own people. It has to be much more careful when it's imposing sanctions or when it's seizing somebody's assets. So I guess that's the answer why we are yet to see some drastic move that would really hurt um, some of these big companies.